morning. And good morning to all those who are listening via various technologies. I'm filling in for Denny. I think everyone knows that he's wanted to be cautious. Hopefully, everything's staying the same and he hasn't contracted anything, but I think he just wanted to be cautious. So, Denny, we miss you. And here's to, well, not a speedy recovery. I think you're doing okay. So, but here's to seeing you again soon. I wanted to just offer a little bit of encouragement. I think we can all agree that 2020 has been crazy, and the last couple months have been really crazy. And sometimes, as we approach each day, crazy builds upon crazy, and sometimes you kind of lose your direction. During times of uncertainty, chaos ensues. You get confusion, fear, anger. So I just wanted to mention three things to help maybe guide us through this so we can be sure we keep a firm foundation in our daily struggles and our goal to get to heaven. The first suggestion I have, and we've kind of recently been in my family been discussing this with our kids, is avoid emotional reactions. Avoid emotional reactions. Sometimes we find ourselves making judgments, making decisions based upon how we feel at that moment. They say, I can't remember the exact statistic, but I want to say upwards of 90% of people's decisions that they make are emotional. No matter what evidence you're going to give them of something to the contrary, no matter how much data you give them, they're going to hold to that decision because it's based on emotion. And I find that fascinating that nobody wants to concede to something based upon what is known because of how they strongly feel about it. I got to thinking about that because I know when you see that, you know the Bible has something to show about it because it's written by the author of our lives, right? The word comes from the person who created us. So you can go to Saul and you can find everything of what not to do. You can take Saul, a man who had all the potential in the world. They looked at him for the first king of Israel and said, that's the man. He had all the potential. He had two paths. And he had to choose which path. And I think we all know the end result of that, what path he chose. In 1 Samuel 14, 24 through 46, we're going to see one of Saul's reactions, how he handled something. And the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day, so Saul had laid on oath on the people, saying, cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I avenged on my enemies, so none of the people had tasted food. That was emotional. Why would you do that? We know what happened before. Jonathan had gone in and basically saved the day. And I don't know what he was feeling at that time, but I can say right now that was an emotional reaction. Now, when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping. But no one put his hand up to his mouth, for people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. So he put out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food this day. And the people were faint. Then Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey. He saw the benefit in it, and kind of another way of saying, why is he saying that for? It's hurting us. He's doing something, requiring something, binding us to something that is only hurting us. And that decision to do that was not based upon reason, it was based upon an emotional decision. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found? For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood because they were starving. They were faint. Then they told Saul, behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood. And he said, you have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here. And Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep and his slaughter them here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he had built to the Lord. Then Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good to you. But the priest said, let us draw near to God here. And Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. And Saul said, come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how this sin has arisen today. Well, we know why it's arisen. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But there was not a man among all the people who answered him. Then he said to all of Israel, you shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. Therefore Saul said, O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people Israel, give Thummim. And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Then Saul said, cast the lot between me and my son Jonathan. And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey at the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am, I will die. That came back full circle. And you see the error, because of an emotional reaction to something, he was now faced with what I do with my son. And Saul said, God, do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. And now if he backs away from his word, can't do that. He's king. He's got to follow through. But look who comes to his rescue. Then the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground. For he has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. All because Saul decided not maybe think on something, to meditate on something. But because of his insecurity, he made a rash statement, and he made a rash decision. And it came back to bite him. And how do you think it made him feel now that Israel had to come to Jonathan's rescue? How does that make him look? It doesn't. It makes him dig his heels in a little bit stronger now. Now contrast that with Daniel. In Daniel 1, verses 3 through 8. Then the king commanded Eshpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So they were bringing these kids in who were very intelligent. They were teenagers, very intelligent, the best of the best, the cream of the crop, because they wanted them to teach them the way of the Chaldeans, wanted to teach them the way of that land, of King Nebuchadnezzar. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate. So the king was going to give them the food that he eats and the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these men were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, and Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. He was wise enough. He did not react. He knew that if he were to go eat the king's table and be enticed by that food, he knew what that would do. He knew that that was going to make him to make maybe some emotional decisions based upon how good that food is. And then he would not be able to carry out what he knew was reasonable, or in other words, what God wanted. He knew he would not be able to carry out. He would maybe become accustomed to the ways of the Chaldeans. So anything that we're faced with today, we need to maybe sit back and give it, I call it 24-hour rule. Don't react emotionally before it gets you too far down that path, if there's no turning back for whatever it is. Instead, think reasonably on what is being said and compare it to what reality is. And speaking of reality, that's the next thing. Seek truth. Point number 2 is seek truth. And we know in John chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." John 1:14. And in John 18:37, then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." We know that there's a reality, there's a truth that we experience every day. It doesn't waver, it's the same, it's constant. We live in a world where they want to bend the truth. I think it was, it'll come to me in a second, World War II, Great Britain. I'll think of his name anyway, but Churchill, thank you. Winston Churchill, I think he says, truth is so important that it's often surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. And that's a true statement. That's how important truth is. It's protected by a bodyguard of lies. And people want to bend the truth to form their own reality. That sets them on a path of destruction, because that's a false reality. Then you become, your feet are planted firmly in midair. But if you buy into that, you can be sitting right next to them. There's a book called Abolition, The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. I want to paraphrase it because it really hit home to me when I had read it. But the book says C.S. Lewis is only commenting on this elementary book, or it's a school book that these two authors wrote. And he was commenting that they were careless in the way they wrote this book, because the book, even though it was instructing of something else, the subject matter was, or the instruction was based solely on something else, but the material used was information that wasn't based on truth to where it could subconsciously affect these children to when they could the logical outworking of those of that information in there, they could reach conclusions or draw conclusions or reach a philosophy themselves and not know where it came from. It's kind of it's almost like implanting this information in the kids to where when they got older, they could put together these philosophies that are on their own reality. And what this reality is the book harmlessly, and he didn't accuse him of it. He wasn't saying that they did it on purpose, but if you don't base it on reality, it can have an impact, and they got to be aware of it. But it was based upon these two people out, and they see a waterfall, and the waterfall, one makes a comment that the waterfall was pretty, the other makes a comment that the waterfall was sublime. But these authors said, well, that's just your feeling. You feel it's that way. When in reality, that waterfall is deserving of its beauty. It's true. And if you take that and extrapolate it out, he was commenting that there's a reality in the world that we live in. God created what is real. And if you start twisting that and you start having people say things on way that they feel towards something, he says you have the intellect, the brain, and then you have your stomach, which they say is kind of that animalistic drive. Then you have in between is the chest. And what you're going to do is you're going to end up raising men without chest. Because now when it comes to doing something that's noble, or to doing something that's worthwhile, you won't have men to do it. Because you will be, they said, it'll be like taking like a horse, making him a gelding, and then say, be fruitful. You're taking what is real and what is meant for good, you're twisting it around, and you're taking away what is real and what is true. And that's what we're facing that today. We're inundated with all sorts of stuff. But we have a creator who created us, who gave us truth through Jesus, who we can look at, and we can base all what we find on that standard. And that's what we need to do. We don't need to get emotional about things. We need to understand that our creator gave us a mind that we can judge and compare things to. And we don't need to become worried about our life or what's going to happen, because we know we have truth on our side. And we don't need to be fearful of anything. We don't need to be worrisome. We don't need for it to get us down, because our reality is based on truth. Number 3, and the last one. Be bold. Be bold. Know where you are anchored. And I'm not saying we have to go out and be bold to the world and stand. Start with your family. Start with a close friend. Be that person who is the rock. Be that person who is strong for them. Don't be that person who whimpers, who doesn't know what to do. Be that person who is strong. Because if it starts there, it's going to go outward. It's got a ripple effect. Don't be tossed about like the wind. I want to use my another example of being bold in Saul. In Saul, chapter 1, verses 15, I'm sorry, 1 Samuel 15, chapter 15, verses 14 through 21. And Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. And the rest we will devote to destruction. Then Samuel said to Saul, Stop. He was going to try to bluff Samuel. He was going to try to twist his own reality, make up his own reality and truth. It's partially true, but Samuel wasn't going to fall for it. I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night. And he said to him, Speak. And Samuel said, Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? I've I've read this many times, and I've always kind of blown by that. I read this again, and I'm not quite sure. I think I was just reading from the first passage I read of Saul and what he did earlier. But as I was reading through this, I kind of skipped over that. I knew Saul was insecure. He wasn't. He wasn't always insecure. He was he's a big guy. He's a big strapping guy. I mean, God, Samuel, that's who they were choosing to lead Israel because of his potential. What he was doing caused him to be in the position he is in now. He did it to himself. But I never noticed that Samuel told him that even though you are little in your own eyes, he said that's what God told him. Even though you were little in your own eyes, you're the head of Israel. I say it as like, hey, even though you're this way, you got to know who you are. In other words, there's no reason to be little in your eyes. You come down to yourself, but you're the head of Israel. The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and said, Go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil inside the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took the spoil, sheep and oxen, and the best of things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God of Gilgal. That's not what he said to do. He's the leader, right? He is the leader of Israel. But he was going to try to pawn it off. God says, leave nothing. So guess who has to go in because of he lacked boldness? Guess who had to go clean up the mess? I don't know if I would want to see it, but Samuel. Samuel went and says, on down the chapters, he went and cut Agag to pieces. I'm sure that Samuel, he wasn't the king of Israel, but not only that, they didn't want a king. You go down that road too. But they have a king. He was in charge, and he should have done it, but he lacked that boldness. But he shouldn't have not been bold. He should have been bold, just like we are. We're Christians. We're in a covenant relationship with Christ. We have authority here on earth. We should not be fearful. We should be bold because we have Christ on our side. We have authority over Satan as long as if we stay in that covenant relationship with Christ. We shouldn't be scared of what man can do to us. Jesus said, be fearful of what your Father in heaven can do. And I often think back a lot of Saul, just because of what it said, the direction his life could have taken. And it's kind of sad, really. In Ephesians chapter 6, 11 through 20. Ephesians chapter 6, 11 through 20 and we'll end with this passage here on boldness. Because the one thing that I will say, if you dwell on the negative, If you dwell in negative, it will take you over. There's a reason why we need to study diligently, and I've been trying to do it myself, and I'm not always the best at it. But if you constantly look to the past and you're dwelling on the past and what's happened in the past, Paul talks about in Philippians, he looks to the future because he knows where the past will take you. You've got to keep going towards the goal. And if you don't, it's going to bring you back to the past in a place you don't want to be. And if you're not looking to the future, maybe some things need to be switched or changed. Maybe some internal, you do some internal looking, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who are willing to help. But you've got to be on that trajectory of going to the future. Because if you're dwelling on things in the past, it's going to hurt. And I don't think anybody wants that. It's a lot easier said than done, but I think that every day of edifying yourself with positive things biblically, as we're getting ready to read here in Ephesians chapter 6, 11 through 20. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and the shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the sword of God, or which is the word of God, praying at all times in spirit, with all power and prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak. If you're relying on yourself to be bold, I know sometimes we do that. We think there's something that we need to do. But if you have Christ, you have something that nobody else has. You have the Word, you have the author of this world, and you have truth. And no matter what anybody spews at you, you can always take that, compare it to what we know is true, and have confidence. And that's kind of what it's all about, is having that security in Christ and knowing what he is to us and what he has done, that gives us that hope and gives us that confidence that we need here on this earth. And when you do that, if you just have a small family or your friends, start there and just let it go. Let them know that there's something about being around spirit-filled people that's uplifting. And the only time that the Spirit of God came back to Saul's heart, or came back to Saul, is whenever he was around David, who was filled with God's Spirit, because God's Spirit came upon him when he was going to be the next king. But that's the only time that the Spirit came back to Saul. Other than that, it said the Spirit of God had left Saul. So I hope these 3 points were helpful. Let's stay out of the emotional reaction to things, because we know what truth is, and let's speak it boldly and act like we're Christians, and we walk around like we have some boldness, some attitude in a good way. So with those thoughts in mind, we always want to offer heaven's invitation. If there are any of those who want to put on Christ or just need to pray for the church, now's the time to do this as we stand and sing the invitation song.